You're listening to RTFM, the podcast where electronic music artist dolltr reads the friendly manual. Each episode will explore different pieces of literature, including user guides, manuals, and appendices created by music product manufacturers for their users and fans around the world. I'm your host, dolltr. In today's episode, we're going to take a read at a book that I really enjoy that is a little bit like a manual. I would almost think it's more akin to something on the appendices side of things, but this is a book that has taken me through a lot of creative troubles. It's a book that's called Making Music, and it's written by Dennis DeSantis. I wanted to read 3 chapters from this book. Dennis presents a couple of problems that producers might face, and then he presents some solutions that might work for them. So I wanted to read 3 of my favorite chapters about the problems of beginning. Here we go. Making Music, 74 Creative Strategies for Electronic Music Producers by Dennis DeSantis. Problems of beginning. Listening to music you hate. Problem. Although you listen to a lot of music, you tend to listen within a specific set of genres, and you pretty much exclusively listen to music that you like, or at least music that you expect you'll like based on your previous experience, recommendations, etc. Even if you write exclusively in a single genre, you owe it to yourself to spend some time listening to a wide variety of music. Here are some tips for how and why to listen to music that you may not enjoy. Solution. Most people listen to music for entertainment, but producers and composers owe it to themselves to also listen in order to learn something. Inevitably, this will mean spending at least some time listening outside of your comfort zone to music that you don't like. This is more than just listening to genres that are closely related to what you normally listen to. For example, if you consider yourself primarily a techno producer, don't be too proud of yourself if you occasionally listen to house music. It's critical that you expand your range of listening to genres that you would never normally listen to for pleasure. Why is this important? As you listen, consider the following questions. Are there musical techniques you can use? If you write in only one genre, and especially if you listen to only one genre, perhaps you've developed a set of working techniques that's fairly consistent and appropriate for the kind of music you make. This may work for you, but it also exposes you to the risk of writing the same music over and over. Other types of music may be made in entirely different ways, and perhaps there are techniques from those worlds that you can appropriate for your own use. As an example, consider opera, a genre that many electronic producers probably don't spend a lot of time listening to. A single opera may last for hours, a timescale that's closer to an entire DJ set than a single track. How does tension and release work over this amount of time? How does form work? What about harmony, rhythm, melody, overall sound? Are there production techniques you can use? In addition to musical techniques, there is also a huge amount you can learn about production when listening to other genres. Consider country music, for example. Whatever you might think of this music as entertainment, there is no doubt that contemporary country music is generally extremely well produced and borrows a lot of mixing and production concepts from contemporary pop music. But there are some significant differences. For example, vocals in country music are often much louder than vocals in pop music or in electronic genres with vocals. Also, pop music and many electronic genres tend to be quite bass-heavy, while country tends to emphasize guitars and other mid-range instruments. Why do people like this? No matter what you're listening to, and no matter how terrible you think it is, someone out there loves it. And unless you're writing music exclusively for yourself, it's a useful intellectual exercise to try to understand why people like what they do. There are, of course, social pressures. People like things because they're popular, or because their friends like them, or because they represent a recognized signifier for a particular subculture. But there are also genuine musical preferences which vary widely and wildly between people. Even if you have no intention of writing music for the opera or country music, thinking about how other music works and why disparate groups of people like what they do can help you become a more well-rounded musician, which can only improve your music. So that was the chapter, Listening to Music You Hate. Now let's move on to a chapter that's called Presets as Starting Points. Problem. You can quickly make music using presets, loops, libraries, sample packs, etc. But you're not necessarily comfortable with this approach and are unsure about whether or not it's cheating. There is a lot of disagreement and strong opinion about whether or not you can really take credit for your original music if you're not also programming your own sounds. Some electronic musicians are also highly skilled synthesizer programmers and or sample manipulators, and they talk with pride about how the first thing they do when they get a new piece of equipment is erase all of the presets. Often, the underlying philosophy behind this approach to composition emphasizes sound as the principal parameter of the music. Many musicians who focus intensely on sound design also work with a fairly restricted harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic palette. For them, it is timbre choices that largely define their artistic signature. This is common in, for example, minimal techno and some experimental styles. On the other end of the spectrum are electronic musicians who have no interest in sound design and instead create their music entirely by assembling existing loops and samples. For these musicians, the focus is generally more on harmony, melody, and rhythm, and less on timbre. This is not to suggest that the sounds are arbitrarily chosen or used without a care, but rather that there may be a range of acceptable sounds for a particular song part, and that the notes are given more compositional attention than the sounds. This is common in, for example, trance and some house music. In an abstract sense, this is also common in more conventional genres like classical music or rock. In these genres, the available selection of instruments, and thus the essential palette of sounds, is generally a defining characteristic of the genre, and the composition is then largely about using those instruments in the service of melody, harmony, and rhythm. Which approach is the right one? Perhaps neither. Consider instead a middle ground between the two that can maximize musical productivity while minimizing the feeling that you're not taking enough ownership of your music. So for the longest time, I've loved listening to podcasts and audiobooks. And when I finally started to get RTFM going, I was so happy to come across Anchor. Anchor is pretty much the easiest way to make a podcast. It's free, and it offers creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor also distributes your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more outlets. You could also potentially make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. I've been loving my experience with Anchor, so if you've been thinking of starting your own podcast too, it's everything you need in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. That's Anchor, ANCHOR.FM to get started. So here's the solution. Instead of approaching sound design as an all-or-nothing endeavor, use presets, samples, and loops as the point of departure for each song part, but with the implicit understanding that you will devote some part of your music-making time to fine-tuning the sounds to suit your particular taste and needs. Purists may always start from a synthesizer's default preset, but this feels like an unnecessary and time-consuming restriction. It means starting from the same state of controls, regardless of intended musical content, and then gradually tuning the sound outwards to gain distance from the default. Instead, consider beginning the writing process by using a preset that is at least in the same family as the instrument you're writing for. If you're working on a bass line, explore your synthesizer's bass presets guilt-free. Once you've found one that's as close as possible to the sound you imagine in your head, then work on the other parameters of the part, the melody, rhythm, etc. Then, after you have some music underway, come back to the sound again and begin tweaking it so that it takes on your own unique signature. For musicians with absolutely no sound design experience, this may sound like an intimidating process. But once you learn just the very basics of synthesizer theory, you'll find that this knowledge can be applied to almost any synthesizer. For example, filters and basic ADSR envelope controls can be found on almost any piece of hardware or software, synth or sampler. And by using nothing more than these parameters, this is usually no more than 6 total controls. You can come up with a huge range of variations from a given preset. Commit at least enough of your music making time to sound design so that you can be proud of the sounds you use. For the truly discerning electronic musician, it's unlikely that any preset will ever be the perfect choice for the particular music context. But it might be close. From there, you may need only a few tweaks before you found something that is uniquely your own. So this is the third and last chapter I'd like to share today, and I hope you find it useful as well. Personal workflow. Problem. The more you read about music production techniques, the more you get the sense that you're doing everything wrong. Some tutorials advocate working on sound design, composition, arranging, and mixing in that order and as entirely separate processes. Others recommend doing them all at the same time and working each section of the song to completion in all aspects before moving to a different part of the song. But none of these solutions feels quite right. And now you're more confused and discouraged than you were before you read anything. What is really the optimum workflow? Reading multiple tutorials or books about music production can make you feel suspicious that it's all just subjective. There seems to be so much disagreement from one source to the next that it all feels somewhat arbitrary. So who has the right answers? Solution. When it comes to optimal workflow, there is no objective right answer. The only way you can find a workflow that's optimal for you is by trying out various methods, keeping the parts that work, rejecting the parts that don't, and synthesizing your own solution out of what remains. When you're reading a tutorial, you're really reading about a workflow that has worked for a particular writer. A different writer may have an entirely different experience, and so will have advocated an entirely different approach. If you have trouble getting music done, it's worth looking at the workflows that other people advocate and give them a try. But don't expect that any one person's approach will yield better results for your particular case than an approach that you develop yourself. It's true that when trying out another method, you may see a dramatic shift in your productivity, either positively or negatively, and if things are better, then it's likely that you found a direction that's better than the one you were on before. If things are worse, you should probably abandon this direction and try something else. But in the end, even the best third-party workflow will benefit from your own personal tweaks and modifications. Once you have the sense that you're going in the right direction, the key to optimizing your personal workflow is to practice it until it becomes a habit. Practice the steps just as you would practice an instrument, refining and adjusting as you go. Eventually, the workflow will stop being work and just become flow, the things you do unconsciously while creating. This all sounds quite abstract, but there really aren't so many possible things to consider. At a fundamental level, music production workflows all involve answers to the following questions. What are the things I need to do? Is there an order I should do them in? And if so, what is it? When should I move on to the next thing? When do I know I'm completely done? Once you understand how to answer these questions for yourself, not as absolutes, you will have developed your personal workflow. All that's left to do is make music with it. So that's all that we have for today, and thanks everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to it, and you can also follow my work on various online platforms. I spell my name as dolltr!CK. My website is dolltr.com, and you can find me on Instagram, Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, Twitter, Anchor for this podcast, and more. If you enjoy my content and would like to support my creations, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/dolltr. Or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can head over to ko-fi.com/dolltr, because I love coffee. My original music is also available from download on Bandcamp at dolltr.bandcamp.com, so please consider supporting me there if you can as well. And one last thing, in celebration of Women's History Month this March, I'm taking commissions for new musical content. You can head over to dolltr.com/WHM for more information about how to commission a song from me if you'd like to do so. Once again, thanks so much for tuning in, and have a lovely rest of the day. Dolltr.